United States Department of Agriculture.
Yeah, so our last data team is University of Georgia, dealing with the Georgia variety trial data. It looks like Daniel is already queued up, sharing his screen. And so, Daniel, you want to go ahead and tell us about your data?
Okay, thank you very much, Cheryl. So my name is Daniel Mailhot, and I run the statewide variety testing program at University of Georgia. The program, it's been around since the mid-'70s, and basically we do variety testing of all of the major row crops and forages. Basically everything except for fruit or vegetables. And so because our program's been in existence as long as it has, I mean, we've got huge data sets. But the problem that we've ran into over time is that, you know, as data formats have changed, I mean, basically we don't have ready access to everything, essentially. And so what we were trying to do essentially was to go through and try to figure out, you know, how are we going to compile this data in such a way as to be able to make it available to modelers. And so just to give you an example here, so what we normally do is we conduct variety tests, you know, within a given year. And then we publish a report during the wintertime, you know, which would be geared towards farmers and extension agents. And this is an example of one right here. This one in particular is soybeans and sorghum. And so, I mean, there's lots of different things in there. And so what we'd have, the information that would really be of interest to modelers, essentially, is these individual locations, because we have different varieties, we have yields, we have maturity date information, just all kinds of stuff about them. And these are tested at multiple locations around the state.
Daniel, can I interrupt you for a minute?
Sure, go ahead.
Can you zoom a little bit, because it's really hard to read the small characters?
Yeah. Thank you for asking. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see that a little bit better. But yeah, so basically you'd have different maturity dates, you'd have plant heights, you'd have lodging measurements, seed sizes, seed quality, whether they shattered or not. You know, and it would depend on the crop and the test as to, you know, exactly what data was collected. But it's really a broad range of things, and some of these, they do vary a little bit based on environmental conditions, such as plant height, for example. I mean, because generally the more moisture you have, the taller your plants would be. And so it's really a large data set. So in the case of soybeans, for example, you know, we'll usually test anywhere from 80 to 100 varieties in a year. And some of those varieties come back, you know, the next year. And so some of them might be in the test for 8 years or more, whereas others are in for short periods of time. And so you've got overlapping varieties. And so there's really a lot of different things that you can look at there potentially. So what we were trying to do essentially was to figure out, how do you get from a PDF file that looks something, you know, that looks like this, to something that's actually convenient for someone to, you know, to do work with. Okay, and so what we came up with was this file, this style file essentially that's available on Ag Data Commons. So what we have is, for every environment, each environment has a separate row here. And you know, it would be a different environment based on it being a different location or a different randomization, because sometimes you'd have varieties present in one randomization, but not all randomizations. And so there's really a lot of different things there. And so we were trying to convert everything over to ICASA variable names. You know, and I mean, we're looking at, you know, planting dates and harvest dates, the previous crop, seed planting or seeding rate information, just really any information that we had, we wanted to be able to convey into these final data sets. And so this is just an overview of the environments themselves. For the locations, we use primarily the same locations around the state of Georgia every year. And so we've got GPS information, we've got elevations, and then we've got the actual field observations themselves. Okay, and so when you're looking at these numbers here, these are the ones that were actually showing up on those PDF table that we're looking at. And so, you know, I mean, it's all in one big spreadsheet essentially, where you can be brought in that way. And you know, we're using the ICASA variable names, and then we also recorded all the fertilizer information. And so it took, I don't know, quite a while to really try to go through and, you know, be able to, you know, to proof everything and make sure, you know, that we have things correct. And it was an interesting experience though, because what it really does, it makes you think about, you know, the work that you're doing. and how you're doing things. Because, as you're trying to make this information available, you start to notice things. So, for example, like on our soil test information, we would report what the initial soil fertility was, and then the amount of fertilizer applied. Okay, so the problem was, and this has been, the way we did it historically, was that we were reporting soil fertility as a category, essentially of low, medium, high, and very high. And we could tell you what the fertility ranges were for each of those, but we weren't reporting the actual number, to where then when you try to add that number, add the amount of fertilizer that was added, you essentially, you're not adding two single numbers to where you can come up with a final number. And so that's something that we've modified now in terms of how we're reporting our data, is to make sure we're saying essentially how many pounds per acre of phosphate you have present. And I don't know, I'm trying to remember, there's a lot of just little nuances like that I've seen in the data sets. For example, in terms of how we were storing the data, we would record how many plots per acre were present, and we would use that in our formulas for then calculating yields. Trying to extrapolate from the yield of the plot itself, to our, bushels per acre, which is our standard reporting measure. And the difficulty with that is that even though it essentially tells you what your plot size is, it doesn't inherently tell you what your row spacing is. And so in the case of our data sets, luckily we have enough, just institutional knowledge, of the program, that we were able to know what our row spacings were at different sites, during what year periods and everything. But it just sort of reinforces that need to make sure that you're really, really sure of exactly what information needs to be recorded on each experiment. Listed plot length need to be two separate numbers and not just a combination of the two. But yeah, so we went through and we were able to get several different ones as far as what's called the different crops. We were focusing basically on a several year period leading up to the initiation of the ARDN project. Longer term, what we're going to need to do is I'm going to need to figure out exactly how to efficiently provide updated data. And what I'm hoping is that basically each year, I'll be able to put on a new file that would include, everything since the previous update, and hopefully be able to move backwards in time with the size of that file as well. Because we weren't able to go beyond 2014, I believe was the earliest on any of the crops. And that went back to just, issues about how the data is formatted. One of the other kind of questions that we ran into a little bit, was to what extent is it worthwhile to try to focus on essentially making these results available versus the underlying plot data. And because we had access to the Excel files that were used for generating these PDFs, it was easier in this case for us to focus on the results. Whereas on some of the older data sets, there might be what's called, if we only have a PDF and we don't have the underlying files that were used to make it other than the data itself, then you'd have to essentially probably, you'd either have to enter your data by hand, enter your results by hand, or you'd have to go back to the original source data and regenerate the results. And so that's one of those scenarios, that you can run into quite a bit. But yeah, I mean, ARDN has been a really, really amazing project to get to work with. I mean, because it causes you to go back and look at how you do things, and to ask those kinds of difficult questions. If someone is trying to use this data that is not associated with the program, how are they going to be able to use it without somehow, running into some kind of a detail that they weren't expecting? I mean, in the sense of how you can apply that data, perhaps. And so, yeah, I mean, it's been a really, really good project, and definitely a good learning experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. Any questions about the Georgia variety trials or the way that Daniel has manipulated these data for ARDN? Roger, get your hand up.
So I had two things. one was the fertilizer. You were talking about there was like low, medium, high, and you decided to actually put in the data values there. So in CropSys, this is something we didn't have, that exact kind of thing, but what we ended up doing was describing or having a file that describes the composition of the fertilizer. And the fertilizer could be anything. It could be organic matter, or it could be a inorganic, commercial product or something like that. So the point I'm making there is that I would like to see kind of like an ontology or a parameter list that is a little more universal for describing fertilizers. And even like the one thing that I was thinking for the AgMIP ACE conversion, we don't use these code things for code fertilizer like FE whatever, those numbers. It's not a concept that I have, but my thinking was to create the CropSys style fertilizer description files, and then having a file with that name, that ECASA fertilizer code or something like that. But just something, to think about, that there could be more a more universal mechanism for specifying for fertilizers, organic or inorganic.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And it's one of those things where it's kind of hard to tell sometimes, how much information needs to be provided. Because like in the case of nitrogen, for example, usually we just report it as essentially units of nitrogen, which seems to be, the preferred standard among farmers. Going back to who our primary users are for the data. But there's data showing, that in some of these crops, whether it's urea versus nitrate, nitrogen really does matter. That some of the crops show sensitivity. And unfortunately, in our data sets, we don't have that recorded anywhere that I know of. And what I'm hoping is that eventually we're going to be able to go back and essentially obtain some of the information that we don't have currently, like with soils, for example, with the soil testing, for example. I spoke to somebody at our soils lab at the main campus, and what they said was that if I could provide them with the sample numbers that were originally sent along, that they could give me those results. And then that would give me, for example, magnesium and calcium levels, which we do not currently have in our data sets. And so I think that's something that people probably kind of need to consider a little bit, is essentially like old records that are sitting around and haven't been used, because at a lot of these farms, these research farms around the state, they might still have some of that information. I'm sure not all of them do, but some of them might have at this point still data that we could utilize for figuring out, for essentially adding more quality to this data set, for being able to answer more questions. But yeah, as far as, trying to standardize things, you really have to standardize them as much as possible. And I think that's the real value, in the ICASA database, is just the ability to do that.
Great, thanks. So we've got a couple more questions queued up. So Phil?
Yeah, really cool to see this type of data being made available. I had two questions. One, I've been talking to people locally here with about making variety trial data available, and there's real hesitation on the part of those running the trials to provide the raw data because of concerns about possibly private entities taking subsets of the data and making them say things that might not be actually valid statistically if you analyze the whole trial. So sort of p-hacking or other types of things to make their varieties look better.
Mhm.
So I was curious as to, is the is like the rep level data being made available currently in what you've described? I wasn't clear on that point. And if so, do you have any concerns about that? Have you had any conversations related to that?
Okay, so what we've provided so far is not to rep level. It's
Okay.
essentially the average of the 3 or 4 plots of that variety.
Right. Okay.
So that's something that I think would make sense to look at longer term, because most of these analyses, these were randomized complete block designs. And to the extent that we can go back and figure out the range and column positions of these plots, we could do spatial analyses and actually essentially have an improve the result, which would take out some more, random variation and hopefully make it better for modeling. Now that would be a lot of work, because somebody would have to find actual field maps and, be sure of exactly how these plots were arranged. But yes, I think getting to the plot data is extremely useful. But so the situation you were talking about with that reluctance, that seems to be a fairly widespread concern among variety testing programs. So when you look at variety testing programs around the state, they're really kind of unique as far as research goes. And the reason for that is that most of our work is not grant funded. It's funded by entry fees by private companies with some amount of support from the home university. And so the problem with that is that, anytime that you have a data set and you're looking at plot data and you're trying to identify outliers and decide whether something needs to be dropped out or not, the problem that you run into is that if for example, you have a low performing plot and you think there was something wrong with it, that it wasn't just low yielding, that there's actually a problem and that it needs to come out. It's one of those things where, basically a company would always want to have its lowest yielding plots dropped, but you can have the same kind of problems on the high side. If you ended up with a yield that was 50% higher than everything else, it was probably a malfunction in the combine, as opposed to just a high yielding plot. And so then the problem is that if a company sees that you have dropped out their incredibly high yielding plot, there's pushback on stuff like that. And so it creates, and that's because so there's an annual variety testing meeting, that most of the programs participate in, and those kinds of things, they've come up in discussions before. And so that's where a lot of that concern is because of our funding sources. If we had large scale access to grant funding for doing variety testing work, I don't think that would be as much of a concern.
That actually leads into my second question, which is, I'm really glad that you're doing this, but what's the motivation from your end as the person running this variety testing program? What's in it for you?
There's unfortunately there's not a whole lot.
That's what I was worried about.
And I think that's why we haven't seen more participation in so far. And okay, so from my standpoint, I could potentially benefit by being able to publish the data set and have it cited. And so then when it comes to annual reviews and everything like that, it makes me look a little bit better. I've thought about, if there's any way to monetize it, but it doesn't really seem like there's a good path for trying to do that. So what tends to happen is, universities don't really want to fund applied research very much. They really want something that's more prestigious. And to the extent that we can be involved with the modeling community, that actually does essentially raise our reputation with administrators. So that's kind of the incentive for variety testing programs, to participate. So it's not a real strong incentive, but hopefully it's enough that, that we can see it become a little bit more widespread.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more quick question. And Kelly, you've had your hand up for a while, so go ahead.
Yeah, hi. And it's actually kind of a follow-up question from what Phil was asking, basically because when I was looking at your data tables, I was trying to figure out at what level you were presenting the data and how you were specifying your unique ID. And so I guess my question originally was, is your data at the rep level or at the treatment level? I was curious, like which of the columns there was providing your unique ID, and like kind of a follow-up question would be, if you were to decide to change to the rep level, how would you structure your data tables differently?
Okay, so if we were to, okay, so yeah, what was presented, that's all at the treatment level. I think it would be pretty straightforward. I mean, for switching over to providing it at the rep level. I mean, we essentially, we'd have to have a rep column there. And then you'd have 3 or 4 times as many rows within the sheet. But I think that would be probably, yeah, I mean, it would be, you know, incredibly similar to what we have now. You know, except for just having, you know, those additional results. And so then I guess at that point is, you know, it'd be kind of a question is, you know, if you're using that data set, you know, to what extent as a provider of data would you prefer us to be, you know, dropping out things that, you know, that we think, you know, maybe there was exceptional pest pressure on a certain area of the field and we decided to drop that. You know, I mean, to what extent would you want us trying to use our best judgment versus you doing that yourself through, you know, through your statistical means? And I don't know exactly what the, you know, what the answer would be on that.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks a lot. It's good to see such interest in what we're doing. So I appreciate all the comments.
USDA is an equal opportunity provider, employer, and lender.